Chris, this is pretty nice in terms of the colonization. Really giving us a good sense of it, I would imagine.
Is that going to be?
Yeah, so a lot of these are a type of cnidarian. It's a sort of, I guess you could think of it as sort of a coral. These are all polyps, but this thing does not create a hard structure like reef corals. It just forms a mat of these polyps that grow over hard surfaces like the periscope. So a lot of these corals like to get off the bottom because they're susceptible to sedimentation. So if they find a structure like this and can settle out on it that's up off the bottom, then they can really thrive, and that seems to be what's happening here.
Okay, guys, can we just back out a little bit and drop a little more? Thank you, Chris.
Some of those curly white structures there are worm tubes. These are presumably polychaete worms that can extend out, and they settle out also and are filtering the water just up on this raised part of the submarine.
It could also be, too, that there's a different, more noble metal in the periscope shaft, and so it's not going through the same incrustation process as the hull, as the sail.
Yeah, roger that.
Covered with kind of biofouling, but remains nice and smooth.
Yeah.
And those little creatures like that.
Absolutely. Well, here's a good shot here by the shears. You can see the holes in the metal there. This is the battery exhaust. Do you see that there to the left? Down. Nice. Chris, what's this big spiky guy?
So that's a sea urchin, and his official name is Seirios hawaiiensis, and he's probably feeding on some of this maybe bacterial mat or maybe some of the cnidarians, those little coral-like structures on the sail.
Awesome, thank you. Okay. So can we move to the right now to the pulley? Same altitude that you're at.
So Jim, Bruce Mundy from the NOAA Regional Center has joined us over here, and if you got any questions about fish, he's one of the premier fish experts here in the Pacific, so he can help us out with that.
Excellent. Aloha, Bruce. Thank you for joining us.
Tony Tully here with a question.
Yes, go ahead.
I was just asked, what does a battery exhaust do?
When they're on the surface, they open a valve and the fumes. It exhausts the fumes if they have any. These guys were notorious with just a little bit water for giving us some chlorine. And of course these subs are going to be condensing inside. One of the things that you find is, you know, when you go and you spend any time underwater, particularly if you've been in a human environment, and the Curl guys can talk about this at some length, you get condensation inside your craft. So you get enough condensation and you get a little water on these batteries, they're going to give off some chlorine gas. And so when you're running close to the surface and the conning tower is out of the water, you can throw a valve and you can exhaust some of that gas.
Ah, that makes perfect sense. Okay, yes. Thank you.
You bet.
You can sort of see the worm coming out of these little tubes here. Those are those little filaments, because that's the opening of these worm tubes here.
Nice. Nice. For those of you joining us out there, one of the things that we want to point out, and what you're hearing right now, is when we make these dives and we do this work, these are rare opportunities. And so the key point here is as many scientists representing many disciplines are part of the dive team. The power of telepresence is that while there's a few of us on the ship, we have our colleagues, such as those you're hearing from our Exploration Command Center back in the University of Hawaii. We have folks who have called in and are participating from around the world. Everyone brings a different set of experiences, scientific expertise, and so to maximize absolute benefit, to be scientifically effective, cost effective, everybody through telepresence is making observations. You're hearing some of this, other folks are making notes, because we don't get down here very often. This is the first time we have seen this craft in 3 years. And with the benefit of these camera systems, the satellite feed, and the ability to talk and communicate amongst ourselves, marine biologists, archaeologists, historians, physical, chemical oceanographers, geologists, so many of us are able to gain meaningful information and then share it with the world.
Jim, I wonder if we could look at that orange round thing that's just left of center if we're going to be here for a while.
Okay, guys, I want to look at this joint pretty carefully. So, Hans, Terry, everybody, we're going to start here by taking a look at, oh, look, you can see the bolts, and look at that.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
They pulled out of that forward flange down there.
Well, look, the hull has failed.
The flange has partially pulled away, so it looks like it's separated on both sides.
Yes. Yeah, it's actually torn the metal.
A separate element. Wow.
Yeah, so it looks like it failed on both sides. So the flange is pulling away from the bow section, and it looks like it pulled away from the bolts.
Yes.
Wow, look at that.
Wow. There's cracks in the shell, too.
Well, you can imagine that this thing has been suspended for decades with all that weight. It's a real testament that it lasted this long.
It's almost like there was a battle on which side keeps that flange, the midsection or the forward section, and it was kind of a tie.
Yeah, I think we want to make sure that we get some of this footage and some stills over to Don Johnson and the corrosion folks.
Yeah. And also, when we zoom back out, we can put the lasers on and get some measurements of the size of this gap in the forward section if we can.
Absolutely.
So some of the piping on the inside there.
The corrosion's formed domes over each of those bolts. That's really amazing.
See the flanges, so it's still attached here.
So Jim, that kind of wood appearance structure in that flange, that's symptomatic of wrought iron corrosion in the ocean?
Yeah. It's just when it's hammered and the metal's bent, into each other, as it begins to corrode, it just striates like that. Look at that.
And
There's
intrusions, and then
you see the cable there? That's electric cable. It looks like there's more. Well, it may have gapped more on the port side.
Interesting.
Inside of the hull.
Yeah.
I see what looks like a bit of a bus bar for a battery there.
Yeah.
To be a forward battery compartment, and the corrosion on everything in there tells me that, this has been opening up and corroding for a while. This is not something that was, pristine and not undergoing the incrustation process until suddenly breaking away, but over time, opening and allowing that corrosion to take place inside.
Yeah, but I'm not seeing a lot of colonization in there either. Be interesting.
You mean life?
Yeah, roger that.
This area forward, at this forward flange joint was pretty packed. This was the end of the two torpedo tubes.
Yeah.
In here, and that was pretty packed. For this flange joint was.
Yes.
Oh, that's right.
Everything forward.
The torpedo tubes forward.
After the torpedo tubes. So
batteries all afterwards the sail.
Yeah,
that's right.
Going back toward the control room, so there's about maybe 15 feet from this for the flange joint was going back to the control room where the other batteries were. That whole forward section was torpedo.
Yeah, the bow is the torpedo tubes with a little bit of I'm not sure how much bus or ballast goes for it. I'd have to go look at the plans again. But you've got that bulkhead that's right that separates the forward battery from the bow.
So remind me again the distance of those lasers.
10 centimeters.
Is that 10 centimeters?
Roger.
10 centimeters. Okay, so that's a 20 centimeter gap there, and it's 20 plus in the larger areas.
It's bigger on port.
Yeah.
Hello? Yeah.
Oh, I've been kicked out.
Yeah. You should even worry about it. It's insane.
How full would this compartment have been with batteries? How high? Would there be room to maneuver for somebody to crawl in there?
Yes. the crew were able to actively access, because remember the crewman has to be able to go through the forward battery and he has to manually fire the torpedoes if need be.
Is that right?
Yeah, there's a lever for firing them back in the main control, but he can also do it from there if need be.
You've seen these cracks going forward too, these
Yes.
fresh rust lines.
Beautiful work, yes.
Frank, have you seen bolts do that before, where when they're stripped out of holes like that, they just have this complete dome-like corrosion appearance with the products?
No, I haven't seen this before. It's very interesting.
Hans, I've seen it in freshwater, but not like this.
I don't think they pulled out. I think
those
they're
are
actually
bolt heads,
heads,
and they just
I
came right
think
through.
The flange is still together.
Okay.
I think the bolt heads pulled out. So you can see the forward part of the flange is missing. It just separated. So I think the flange is still there, and those are actually the nuts on the back of the bolt.
Oh, okay, I see.
Look at that.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
So you see that
So I think
you see that the bottom has not failed. It's just bent.
Right. It's stressing.
Yeah.
But Terry was telling me these look like the bolt heads, and the flange is still there with the bolts in it, but the forward edge of that has broken away and gone forward.
Yeah, I think those are the nuts on the other flange. The flange is still intact, but you don't see the flange face on the forward section. And I think it just separated at the flange. Yeah, that's what that is. Those are the nuts.
But then that edge of the flange, forward of the eye part, that's what we're looking at.
Exactly. Yeah. So the metal.
Interesting. Metal of the flange itself split.
Right. So that's why you don't see the flange face on the forward section.
So just so you know, I heard from Kelly. She said everything's looking good. So.
Oh, good. Thank you.
So it looks like the hull running toward the bow there at the top, just the crack runs along the entire length of what's in the screen there. Just continues on a little bit longer as well.
Say again?
Okay, pilots, let's go wide and pan back towards the conning tower, please. So Honolulu, we're going to start moving back into position towards the conning tower. The plan is to be in position, and when we are on point, we will walk folks through what happened 75 years ago.
Roger that.
Excellent, thank you.
Tony Tully with an observation.
Yes, Tony.
Just want to be clear, some of the audience may not know. When you refer to the book, are you talking about Lost Submarines, the one that came out just this month?
Yes, the brand new book that just came out.
Title and author?
The Lost Submarines of Pearl Harbor, yes. Yeah, Tony, go ahead.
Lost
Sorry.
Submarines of Pearl Harbor.
Yes, for those of you who are interested, Terry Kirby, Max Kramer, Steve Price, Hans, Olaf Armour, Russ Matthews, myself, with the help of so many friends, both in Hawaii, elsewhere in the U.S., in Japan, on Australia, Rabaul, elsewhere, just completed our scientific report on the first years of the research on these submarines, and as well the archaeology up until this most recent dive, published with our partners at Texas A&M University Press. The Lost Submarines of Pearl Harbor offers historical context and the archaeological story of these craft, including post-Pearl Harbor use of the Type A Midget submarines all the way through to later war variants, and detailed accounts of the discovery of these craft, legal questions around them, the understanding between the United States and Japan as to how these subs are managed and protected as war graves and historical and archaeological sites. And that book, done by all of us as a labor of love, is available, and all of the proceeds go to charity. And it is available on Amazon.com, I've noticed. So, as we get into position, so, ladies and gentlemen who are watching us from around the world and in the United States, and those who are tuned in with the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, we are broadcasting live to you from the NOAA ship Okeanos Explorer, approximately 5 miles off the entrance of Pearl Harbor in 1,300 feet of water. We're a team of scientists, technicians, mariners, joined by colleagues ashore, including marine biologists, oceanographers, and others, engaged in an ongoing mission to better understand what rests in the waters of the United States and at times elsewhere in the world. Ocean exploration is a vital and important part of what we do. The ocean covers 2/3 of this planet, and to date only 5% of it has been explored. Every time we go, we find new life. We find incredible historic sites such as the one you're seeing, which speak to our collective human experience. We see ongoing evidence of humanity's interactions with the oceans, and we're always reminded of how vital and important the oceans are to our ongoing survival as a species. Today, on the occasion of this anniversary, we are giving you the first live look and an interactive opportunity to explore one of 5 Japanese Kohyoteki, or Type A Midget or mini submarines, which were deployed to attack Pearl Harbor 75 years ago. This Midget submarine that you are seeing is one that was encountered and sunk by the USS Ward 75 years ago. And as we commence this dive, visiting this, I want to remind everyone that we are visiting a site which is not only a historical and an archaeological site, but this is a grave. Resting inside this craft, most likely, are its crew, Akira Hiru and Yoshio Katayama, 2 young men who 75 years ago set out in this craft to undertake a mission which ended for them early when they were spotted and sunk by the USS Ward. I'd like to take a brief moment and to offer a few words that they would understand as we commence this dive, with apologies for my poor Japanese. Yasuraka ni onemure kudasai. May you rest in peace. "75 years ago, at this very moment, the United States ship Antares was on its way into Pearl Harbor, passing through the defensive zone outside the harbor, an area actively patrolled by United States destroyers with a war warning and anticipating that if an assault came, it would likely come by sea and perhaps with submarines. In addition to the duty destroyers patrolling, there was an anti-submarine net which had closed off the harbor entrance, which would be opened to allow ships to come in. Thanks to espionage, the Japanese forces embarking that morning to attack Pearl Harbor knew of this gate, and the Midget submariners had been deployed and had been told, wherever likely, follow another ship in and follow closely so that that gate, when it closes, has you inside the harbor. These 5 craft had been launched systematically, one after the other, after having deployed a raid and a fan outside the entrance to Pearl Harbor. At 6:37 a.m., Antares spotted a submarine immediately aft of it, with the periscope and a bit of its conning tower sticking out of the water, mossy green from its time at sea. The submarine was evidently tailing them and was operating against instructions. That is, all submarines coming into Pearl Harbor had to be surfaced. This suggested that the submarine was an enemy vessel. Antares notified the duty destroyer, USS Ward, which had previously answered another call with another submarine, but had not seen that despite an hour's search. That was likely another craft. As Ward approached, flying high above in a PBY spotting aircraft, Lieutenant William Tanner out of Kaneohe Naval Air Station spotted the submarine following Antares. He radioed in. He dropped smoke pots to help to guide Ward to the submarine. Ward, a veteran World War I destroyer brought back into service, was commanded by Lieutenant William Outerbridge, who just 2 days earlier had assumed command of Ward, having previously been the executive officer of another destroyer. Ward's crew were reservists from the twin cities of Minneapolis-St. Paul. They were ready, and they were not caught asleep. 75 years ago, at this very moment, Ward is moving into position. This submarine, 1,300 feet above us, is also still in position, following Antares as Antares' crew watches from the fantail. Ward's crew has just come to quarters 75 years ago at this point. Men are rushing to their stations. Up on the deck, Ward carries 4-inch 50 caliber guns. These are being manned very quickly. Men are going into their positions. Captain Outerbridge is on the bridge, and they are beginning to close the gap. They have spotted the submarine at this point. In the Midget sub, at this point, Hiru and Katayama are probably unaware that they have been spotted. They are continuing on course. Ward opens fire 75 years ago at this very moment. The first shot sings out across the water, sails past the conning tower, and strikes the ocean. It is a miss. The crew at the number 3 gun readies, loads their gun, and takes aim. Gun Captain R.H. Knapp in command of his group, C.W. Fenton, F.B. Nolde, A.A. Dedemagal, D.W. Gruning, J.A. Paik, H.P. Flanagan, E.J. Beckert, and K.C.J. Lash are in position, and they fire. The number 3 gun, 75 years ago at this very moment, hits exactly where you see now. You are seeing the shell hole, the first shot fired by the United States in answer to World War II in the Pacific. It is a very good shot. It strikes the conning tower just close to where it joins the hull here, on the starboard side of the sub at an angle. The shell punches through here, deflects down, and likely exits through the bottom of the hull without going off. The sub begins to dive. At this point, just before the hit, one of the crew, Will Lerner, says that as he watches from the deck, the periscope swivels, spots them, and at that stage likely swivels back. The periscope is now looking more or less forward, and the handles have been folded up, as we know from a previous expedition in which a camera was inserted into that hole to see its handles folded up. At this point, 75 years ago, Ward has surged forward. The chief of the boat, Maskowitz, has loaded depth charges. They're ready to go. They're set to go off in 100 feet of water. And as this submarine begins to plunge beneath the waves, Ward goes right over and drops those charges. The charges go off, bucking the sub back towards the surface and swiveling it approximately 90 degrees. With this, with at least one of the crew most likely dead, perhaps both of them, this submarine begins a long fall that will take probably 20 or more minutes. With a dead stick, its dive planes pushed up. It's porpoising and bucking as it makes its way in a long glide towards the seabed. And approximately 1 mile from where Ward encountered and shot it, this submarine slowly plows into the depths and hits bottom exactly where you see her now. It is just shy of an hour away from the time that the Japanese planes are going to attack Pearl Harbor. Outerbridge sends a message that they have seen and encountered a sub. He then makes it clearer that they have spotted, fired upon, and sunk a submarine operating in the defensive zone. The warning begins to be broadcast through the different levels at Pearl Harbor. By the time it reaches Admiral Husband Kimmel in command of the Pacific Fleet, the Japanese planes have already launched. The warning, while delivered, was still too soon. Or too late, excuse me. And so, at 7:55, the first of 2 aerial assaults commenced, and within a matter of minutes, ships are beginning to sink, fires are blossoming, and other men are dying. We are now moving along aft following the submarine. These craft, 78 feet long, were built in 3 sections, bolted together. As you can see, the joints have failed, both at the bow and at the stern sections. What you see along the top of the submarine is the remains of a wire cable that stretched both fore and aft to cut net. We're now coming to the area, the aft dive planes and the 2 counter-rotating propellers that could drive these submarines in excess of 20 knots. These craft were incredible technological achievements designed by the Imperial Japanese Navy to be used not as a stealth weapon, but as a craft which launched from a larger mothership would swarm in groups of 12 in an all-out open sea battle to engage the enemy. as Pearl Harbor was being planned, the Kohauteki Corps, the young men who were training to use these submarines, insisted they be given an opportunity to participate, and after much debate, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto agreed to let them go, but enjoined them not to die and to come home. Only one would. 9 of the 10 who were deployed that morning were lost with their craft. Only one man survived when his submarine washed ashore. That man, Kazuo Sakamaki, would become America's first prisoner of war. His craft, recovered, studied, analyzed, and then shipped around the country, would be used to sell war bonds in more than 2,000 American cities. We're joined on this dive by a number of folks ashore, as I've said, including the discoverers of these submarines from the University of Hawaii's Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory. HURL, and I've got to say that's one of the best acronyms in ocean exploration I've ever heard, guys, has been at this for a long time. Steve Price, Terry Kirby, Colin Wallerman, Max Kramer, all of their colleagues, Chris Kelly, have been working for years, making incredible dives using these manned submersibles to learn more about what lies out here. That has included analyzing many reports, sonar maps of the area, and then diving as opportunities arise. On August 28th, 2002, they discovered this submarine and have returned from time to time to document it and to carry some of us, myself and Hans van Tilburg also joining us, into the depths, as well as Russ Matthews, who's also joined us. Terry, Chris, you guys, you should probably share a little bit about the discovery of this sub. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Yeah, that was after 10 years of using whatever dives we could to try and find the sub. And the first year, 1992, of those 10 years is when we came across the stern section of what we didn't realize at the time was the fifth and final sub. But with the 3 days that we had to find this, we finally found it on our third and last day. If we hadn't found it then, it would have been another year to try and get to this target. So it was pretty exciting seeing this come out of the dark after that, after 10 years of searching for it. When we went around, and we were pretty excited about this discovery, everybody was pretty high. We went around and we looked at that hole in the conning tower, and it really sobered everybody up because we realized the crew was still in there. So that was really broken away up here forward.
Well, I'll add a few comments too. The submarine was located after an extensive side scan sonar mapping project that had occurred about 6 months before the discovery. And the big problem was that there's a lot of objects down in the defensive sea area and outside the defensive sea area that have been discarded over the years. And so there's many targets that showed up on the side scan, and it was a matter of actually trying to weed through it and pick the best target that could be this submarine. And this caught Terry in my eye immediately, this particular target, and that's what helped locate it.
Yeah, we came up with Chris's survey. It came up with 39 possible targets. And we had 3 days to try and pick the best one. And this is our first choice. And on the third day, finally got to it.
Just a couple of other comments. We dove on this particular target the very first day, and we missed it. And I think that's in your book, Jim. We missed it by just 90 feet or so. It really is small and hard to see. And I was ready to move on to check out some of the other targets on that third dive, but Terry insisted he wanted another go at this target. And that was an absolutely correct decision to make because we gave it another chance and found it on that third dive.
Perforation on the sail? Just dark.
One thing I want to just point out to everybody that's listening in, when all of us do our work, for the most part, either we're doing it by diving with each other in scuba or with a few of us inside the submersibles. And with the Pisces subs, there's 3 that go. So through the years, some of us have been privileged to see these sites, to work on them, but the power of the system now that we're working with enables us to share this with you and live. You're seeing it just as we see it. You're able to hear these stories, and as I said earlier, hear not only from folks like those who found these subs and have been working on them, but other scientists who have insights to offer. There are corrosion experts, marine biologists. We have the participation of historians who have been actively working with Japanese and American sources. I know we have Tony Tully on the line, well known for his historical research. So many others, and they, as well as all of you, are able to see this and to learn from it, to make observations. And that's what science should be. It should be open, accessible, and transparent. That's why I joined NOAA. That's why I'm proud to be on the ship working with this crew and working with everybody ashore as we bring you this live for the 75th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Chris,
Jim, can we turn the lasers on and get a measurement at the top of the stern gap?
Roger that. Lasers coming on. So for those of you watching, there's two red dots that are showing up right now, and those are lasers, and they enable us, they're 10 centimeters apart. So what this enables us to do is measure this gap. We can't just go down there in 1,300 feet and slap a tape on it. So what this does is give us an opportunity to see how far this thing is going apart. And all science, of course, involves at its basic level measurement. As they're measuring this, by the way, USS Ward went on to a long and distinguished career before finally succumbing to kamikaze attack and being sunk towards the end of the war. Before that happened, she'd been reconditioned into a more modernized version of a destroyer, and the number 3 gun, which had fired the first shot, had been removed. Because of its historical significance, it was saved, and today it rests on the grounds of the state capitol there in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. It was put there in 1958 and dedicated in the presence of the surviving crew, most of whom were still there, including Outerbridge. And the gun remains and is the subject of observances today. There's a round table taking place out there in Minneapolis with World War II veterans for the occasion. And the gun, perhaps one of the most important of Minnesota's World War II memorials, is a prominent focal point for people that come and visit the state capitol grounds. So Chris, while we're doing this, maybe you want to share with folks some of the marine biological observations.
Sorry, I was outside talking to some people watching from the outside of the ECC here. Yeah, there's a number of corals. These are sea fans that are growing on the hull, and I've pointed out a few of them in the event log. And so it is being colonized by filter-feeding animals. We did see that crab earlier on the periscope. That's in the family Galatheidae. Or they actually call them squat lobsters. And then many of you probably saw that wonderful octopus that was first appeared on the stern on the Seirios view from camera 2, and he crawls his way all the way to the conning tower to get into the limelight. He wanted to get on the TV as well. And so octopus are very, very difficult to identify. So that's about as far as I can go on that guy. But then there's a lot of the smaller stuff. These could be bacteria, foraminifera, and there's been a bunch of urchins and some barnacles I've seen in hydrozoans. So quite a lot of life that's already on the sub after 75 years.
Excellent. I think the one thing that we keep seeing as we explore these out here is that the deep ocean is a repository not just for history, but it is full of life. Life at different sizes and levels. And in this case, a reminder that while this submarine sunk 75 years ago is a war grave as well as a historic site, it is also now the habitat for a variety of marine life that grow here and are part of the marine ecosystem. Also
this
joining...
gap looks similar to us, Jim, as the forward split where the flange bolts are still intact. And in this case, the aft part of the edge of the flange broke away in the forward gap. It's the forward edge of the flange that broke away, also leaving the flange bolt heads intact.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, you're hearing the voice of Dr. Hans Conrad von Tilburg, who is NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries Maritime Heritage Coordinator for the Pacific. Hans is a veteran of archaeology in these waters with a variety of sites, but included in his work is work on World War II sites. One of his other projects was documenting a PBY sunk out there at Kaneohe during the attack. Hans, one of the things that you've pointed out in our discussions has been that while Pearl Harbor is the name of the attack, it certainly was much larger than the attack on Battleship Row. And I think the site that we're looking at here, 5 miles offshore, is an indication of that and of a three-dimensional battlefield on that morning, both in the air, undersea, and then across the island. Perhaps you'd want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jim. I used to bring that up in class that, you know, when you think about it in terms of sea floor and land, you know, we don't live on islands, we live on the tops of mountains. And everything that's fallen into the ocean or sunk or shot down or lost often remains on the slopes of that mountain. It's just covered with water and we can't see it. But for us here in Hawaii, this type of resource, naval properties from the past, it's quite extensive. It's not just the attack on Pearl Harbor. And like you say, it was an attack on all of the military installations of Oahu. But then all the training that happened in the years that followed and all of the obsolete materials that were disposed has left quite a legacy when you look at the entire inventory of what we know for naval properties in the Hawaiian Islands. You're looking at least 1,400 naval aircraft in the oceans around the archipelago and 90, 100 naval surface vessels and submarines. And that is the kind of thing, one of the things we look at to understand ourselves and our past.
Thank you, Hans. Also joining us and here with me on the ship is Frank Cantelis. Frank is the archaeologist with NOAA's Office of Ocean Exploration and Research. And Frank has been key to a number of projects around our waters. This is one of the most recent one, but with Okeanos Explorer, there's been some other fascinating things, including some dives out in the far Pacific, including a B-29, and some other work. Frank, you might want to tell folks about the role of archaeology in ocean exploration.
Thanks, Jim. Well, archaeology, cultural resources in general are one of the resources that we find on the seafloor. The remains of past events, wars, merchant shipping, even pleasure craft as well. So those remains are out there, and they're a resource that we specifically look for, as well as natural resources in our program. In the past year, we've had the opportunity to visit a number of islands in the Pacific that were important theaters of war. We found a B-29 bomber off the island of Tinian that was part of
Hold and zoom in on that can.
part of the war effort, the American efforts to end the war in 1944 and 45. And we also went to Wake Island, which was actually an area where one of the early battles of World War II occurred in late December of 1941. And we discovered a Japanese merchant auxiliary vessel that served as a water tanker, an unexpected find that was sunk by the American submarine Triton in 1942. And so periodically when we go to these remote places, we have the opportunity to look for these types of resources.
Thank you, Frank. We are now at the stern of the sub and lining up. Looking forward into the gloom, you can see the conning tower just ahead of us. And we're now at the propellers. There are two of these. These are counter-rotating propellers. You can see the propeller guard. And also in this area are the dive planes. Here you get a good view of both sets of propellers.
So I'm just looking at the whole website where it shows the stern as it looked in the original dive, the very first dive on this Midget sub. And these corals that you see growing on the rim, they were not there. They have since colonized the submersible in the last 14 years. It's pretty interesting. I hadn't noticed that, and I was wondering about them. I hadn't noticed them from my memory.
Yeah, that's a good observation. The other thing I want to point out to everybody is, yes, that is a Pepsi can, or some sort of a can there. And there's hardly a place we go where we do our research, even in sites that have never been discovered, where we don't find trash. One of the saddest ironies we see in ocean exploration is that while the oceans are one of our greatest museums, while it's one of our most fragile and important aspects of this planet, it is also our largest dump. And a metal can is one thing, plastics are another, and we see a fair amount of plastics. I'm one of a few scientists who have had the privilege to work on Titanic, and I can assure you there, lying on the bottom, mingled in with the debris of April 14th, 1912, is more plastic and other garbage. It is a problem, and it's a problem not only when it sits at the bottom of the ocean, it's a problem as it begins to be ingested by marine life. Our colleagues ashore in the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, in particular working at Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument, can speak powerfully to the impacts of plastics not only on the marine life but also on the seabirds. A variety of these birds ingest marine plastic. They're filled up with them. They cannot get rid of them. And these birds then starve to death and lie littered on the atolls out there in the monument. We are having an impact as human beings on the marine environment. And in the midst of a somber reflection of the history of 75 years ago, again, we're compelled to point out the fact that we continue to throw garbage into the sea.
You pointed out on that.
Jim, cans and bottles roll pretty well underwater, and particularly in areas south of Honolulu where there are dredge spoils.
Yes.
And debris disposed, and if the bottles and cans roll out of that, they can travel for miles across the bottom until they find some kind of little depression or wreck to lodge themselves against. And so, unfortunate fact, but we see the stuff rolling around the bottom all over the place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And here we are 5 miles offshore, and this thing has certainly made its way along. This is not because somebody came out to the site and threw a can overboard. Terry Kirby, when you were diving on this as a sub pilot and you noticed the position of the planes, you had some observations about how this sub went down and came to rest on the bottom. We talked a little bit about that, but perhaps you'd like to share more.
Yeah, the thing that when we first spotted this on the bottom, the thing that really amazed us was that there was no depth charge damage, which, as we saw in the Monahans, washboarded the hull. And there was no implosion damage, so it sank at a rate below its operating depth that would allow it to flood, so it didn't implode. But the main thing we noticed that was pretty amazing was that there was no impact damage with the bottom. We noticed that the stern planes were in the up position, so that's why we figured it had traveled about a mile planing, and it would have accelerated until it had enough effect that it would have pitched up and then stalled. So we think that's why it ended up this far away. But when we noticed where it was laying on the bottom, the only real damage we saw was the lower lobe of the port side of the prop guard was broken away, and the lower part of the rudder was slightly bent over. So it looked like it had pitched up or stalled just before impacting with the bottom and dragged the tail on the bottom and just gently settled in without denting it. So that's how I figured it got in this excellent condition. They did this long porpoising descent before it impacted the bottom. But those forward torpedo guards were totally intact. There was not a dent in it except for that damage we saw in the tail.
Excellent point.
Another comment, Jim, in your statement about this being an undersea museum. What we're looking at here, just to the west, 550 meters west of the Midget sub, is a PC 578.
Oh, shark.
Oh yeah, there's a look. We're looking at a cook shark.
Oh, shark?
Sure.
Is that a shark?
Yeah, it's a cook shark. Yeah, we've seen these guys down around this area before in sub dives. They're very curious. Again, as I was saying, to the south of this sub is another a Navy sub chaser patrol craft. Is the PC-594, and 765 meters just north of this sub is the wreck of the giant seaplane Marshall Mars. So this is an amazing undersea museum just off of southeast of Oahu.
Absolutely. I think one of my favorite memories, Terry, is having been in the Pisces with you and Hans when we were privileged to join you in the discovery of the Japanese super submarine I-400, and then the USS Kailua, the former cable repair ship Dickinson, which actually was coming into Pearl Harbor on this morning 75 years ago. A reminder, there's so much that rests out here, and just the other day, Okeanos Explorer was looking at another one of your finds, doing some ongoing mapping and documentation of the U.S. submarine S-19, which had been scuttled as part of a Naval Arms Limitation Treaty commitment by the United States in 1938. So, Honolulu, you want to talk a little bit about our visitor?
So about it's a cook shark. They're not uncommon at this depth.
What do these guys eat?
Well, they would probably eat small fish and crustaceans, probably a lot of crustaceans in their diet, foraging for things that are on the bottom, swimming along the bottom. So it's one of the larger predators in this habitat, like sharks are a top predator in a lot of ecosystems. So small crustaceans and fish.
I guess it's pretty important to note here that sharks, thanks to some very famous movies, get a bad rap.